So thank you everybody for being here today for today's session. So my name is Kate Clark and I am one of the IDVAs on the domestic violence team. So if you've not seen me previously, IDVA stands for Independent Domestic Violence Advisor, and we are a team of about 14 that work across the Oldham Borough. So in last week's session, I covered a bit of an introduction to the IDVA service and also types of domestic abuse. So this week's bite-sized session is looking at domestic abuse and responding to a domestic abuse disclosure. Okay. So I'll just wait for the presentation to catch up. We had a little bit of a delay last week with the presentation starting, just waiting for the Wi-Fi to catch up with us, but hopefully it will do in a moment. Okay, so the aim of the session is to look at how we might respond to trauma and what questions we might ask, to understand how trauma can impact victims, and to look at how to create the right environment and things to consider when a disclosure is made to us. Now, I did cover types of domestic abuse in the first session. However, I always like to go over this just to do a bit of a reminder, really, just lots of different types of domestic abuse. Physical abuse is always something that generally springs to mind when we talk about domestic abuse. However, it can encompass lots and lots of other things. It can be physical, obviously, but it can also be psychological abuse. There could be financial control, controlling and coercive behaviour, stalking and harassment. And now with lots and lots of new advances in technology, we're finding that online digital abuse is also on the rise as well, especially when people have access to platforms such as Facebook and that sort of thing, thinking about social media. I mean, there was a time when, you know, people used to stalk and harass, coming to people's houses, they might text, they might phone, and now with technology, that can be all sorts of things can be shared online for lots and lots of people to see. I will mention, as I mentioned last week, we do also have an honour-based violence specialist, the lovely Rehenna, in our team, who deals with honour-based violence and also forced marriage. So if anyone has any questions around that, she'll be more than happy to answer them. And at the end of this session, I will share our contact details as well for the service. Okay, so responding to a domestic abuse disclosure. So people's reactions to experiencing abuse can vary. They may be afraid, angry, or have no outward reaction at all. You may find that someone is overly chatty. You might, when you're talking to someone, you might find that that person is closed off and doesn't want to answer your questions. So it's just to make people aware that victims of domestic abuse display all sorts of emotions, and no two people are ever going to be the same when it comes to disclosing information that's actually quite sensitive. So how you respond to a disclosure can be really important. It takes time for a person to decide what they want to do and how they want to move forward. And you might, in fact, be the first person, you know, that's ever heard this information before. Often people who are struggling with domestic violence will keep things to themselves for considerable lengths of time. And often it can be opportunistic. So what I mean by that is, it may be if somebody is living with the perpetrator, it might be you've had an initial conversation and this might be the only chance that that person has to disclose that they're being victims of domestic abuse and to get that help. So trauma can impact victims in various ways, and trauma is present usually when someone has been subjected to ongoing abuse within a relationship, or even when that person has left the relationship, that abuse can be ongoing post-relationship as well. So in the first few hours of suffering a traumatic event, most people are stunned, shocked, have difficulty believing what's happened. And in the following days, when that person is processing what's happened, they'll continue to feel distressed, confused, and fearful. Now, trauma can present as well with things like memory loss. So you'll often find that when people are recounting events, or they might be giving a statement to the police, a lot of the information can be lost. And we've had experiences previously where people are giving police statements and they may initially have come across like they're trying to withhold some of that information. But actually, the mind is quite a clever thing. When someone is subjected to trauma, what the brain tries to do with a lot of the time is block out some of that difficult information. So you may find that people have lapses in the information they're trying to give you. They might not be able to remember specifics of what happened, certain times, even when it happened, who was there necessarily. And that's just to make that clear that can be a result of trauma. So it's not that somebody's not wanting to disclose and give the accurate information. It might be that the trauma they've experienced is just stopping them from doing that. So this response is normal, and it's important people understand that feeling and thinking this way is a normal response to an abnormal situation. So as I mentioned previously, trauma presents and manifests in lots of different ways. So if you're speaking to clients, whether it's on the phone, if you're coming across people face to face, these are just some things to look out for and recognise. Physical presentations, people might come across as easily startled by loud noises. I was speaking to one lady on a home visit recently, and the cat jumped up onto the side and knocked a cup on the floor, which then smashed in smithereens. And it was just the noise of the cup falling on the floor. You know, it was a bit of a shock, but the reaction was just, she jumped up off the sofa, clearly very distressed. And when you think if someone is in a domestic abusive relationship where there may be things broken continuously, the noise of that cup falling on the floor could have triggered something, you know, that's happened within our life. So I think certain noises, certain smells even, certain phrases that you might say can spark sudden memories for people. So you may find that people are reacting in quite a confusing and distressing way, to be honest. People can be presenting like they're experiencing headaches, migraines. They may talk about difficulty sleeping, getting off to sleep, waking up in the night with horrible nightmares, and just feeling really overwhelmed. In terms of behaviour, as I mentioned earlier, you may get people who are very closed off. You might get somebody who comes across really angry. I met with somebody recently as well, who her response, I mean, she wasn't getting angry at me, but she was getting angry at the situation. So her response to every question I asked was to bang her hands quite forcefully on the table, which when you're not used to that sort of behaviour can be quite scary, can't it? Because I thought, oh, blimey, any minute now she's going to tip the table over. But it was just her reaction to the situation. Avoidance, you might find that people engage with you 1 minute and then the next minute they're not answering your calls or answering the door because they don't want to get out of bed. Might be self-harming. There might be talk of suicidal intention, risk-taking behaviour really, so engaging in lots of risky behaviour and lots of other things that can present. So just continuing that really briefly, interpersonal issues. So people can often have issues holding down jobs, difficulty trusting people, isolating themselves, difficulties if you've been in an abusive relationship, maybe moving on to another relationship. It can be quite daunting for that person. And just to mention, as I mentioned last week, I'll just slip that in conversation. There is something called Clare's Law that you can request by ringing 101. So if anybody you know has been in an abusive relationship and they may be moving on and getting into a new relationship, if they're concerned about the new partner's behaviour and they want to know if that person has a criminal past in terms of domestic abuse, they can request that information is disclosed from the police. And as I mentioned, that's by ringing 101. That's a really, really useful tool, and it can really help protect people who are moving on to new relationships as well. You may find that people have various coping mechanisms. using drugs, misuse of alcohol, self-harm, dissociation. People present in a number of different ways. And there is a tendency sometimes, especially if people are struggling with drugs and alcohol, to try and write that person off a little bit. Well, that they're off the pace on drugs, they're always drunk when I call. This is just the sort of routine and behaviour. But people will often have reasons and coping, and this is their coping mechanism for trying to block out some of them horrendous experiences that they've had in their life. So just to note that people may feel extremely vulnerable at the thought of disclosing. Most people would not ordinarily disclose that they are the victims of domestic abuse. So if you are receiving that disclosure, as I mentioned, it may be just the fact that they've had the opportunity to disclose, and this is the time now where that person has decided they want some help. To put it in perspective, we have lots of referrals that come in from the police. We may contact that person. Sometimes some of them people will say, oh no, everything's absolutely fine, don't know what you're talking about, I don't need any help. Then we might get another referral and another one. So they're coming through our service 3 or 4 times, but maybe on the 5th time we'll ring and that person will feel, actually, I can't take any more of this, I want some help. So when that person is disclosing, they may have told a professional time and time again, I don't want the help. But at that point of disclosure, where they may have not previously, this is the point where they want to make a change to their life and get that help they so desperately need. So it goes without saying, questions should be asked in a respectful manner. I know we'd all do that. And one of the things that people say is, you have an inkling. So if you've had a conversation with somebody and they may have been displaying some of those characteristics that I talked about earlier, things may have cropped up in conversation, but you're not quite sure. How do I start asking someone if they're suffering with domestic abuse? Well, you don't have to go straight in there and say, look, is your other half abusive? It doesn't have to be as full on as that. It can be quite easy, quite straightforward, and it could be something as simple as just saying, are you okay? What's the response from that? Can we then sort of go into a bit more depth from what that person has answered just by asking them that simple question? Giving that person time. They probably won't want to share straight away. You might have asked that leading question, are you okay? And they're probably not okay. But don't expect that person to be going full pelt into, a story of physical abuse and things that have been going on for them in that household, because it's not easy for anybody to share that they've been abused for X amount of weeks, months, or even years. You've got to imagine that someone is at the most vulnerable at that point when they're disclosing. So just let that person know that if they're worried, that you're prepared to listen and you're not going to judge. Relay key points. So if they've said something that's quite significant, it's always useful to maybe just repeat that back to the person. So you're letting that person know that you're not judging, you're taking in the information and you're taking it on board. Don't ever pressure a person to leave. That's a big no-no. I work with lots of people in abusive relationships. Obviously, that's my job, whether they're still in the relationship or not. Now, if someone is living in a household with an abuser, my first reaction would never be to say, you've got to leave this address, it's not safe. Because that person is the victim of a crime and they're entitled to make choices as to what they want to do. No one should ever be forced into leaving their home. We can make steps if a crime has been committed to get the abuser removed by the police. We can find safe accommodation if needed, which I'll go on to in a moment in case anyone discloses that they do want to leave. However, that choice should always be up to them. It shouldn't be us putting them thoughts in their head. It should be that person making their own decisions. I would always say don't criticize the abuser, because when you think that person loved that person once, they may still be desperately hoping that they'll change. They've probably been put down, and in their own heads they might be thinking, well, if I'm just a better person, things will change. All sorts of things go on in domestic abuse relationships. especially when it comes to a controlling behaviour and emotional abuse. So criticising the abuser will probably only serve to shut that person down, and you probably won't get any more information. And where possible, as I've mentioned, don't pressure, but try and provide as many choices as you're able to. So you're at the point now where that person may have disclosed, you may have had to coax that information out. So it's all about empathetic validation. So really, really validating how that person feels. So if they're upset, just explain it's understandable that you're feeling like this. You've been through such a massive ordeal, but we're going to work together, and we're going to give you some choices, and we're going to work together to try and overcome this. If they're feeling angry, validate the fact that you're angry. Well, they've got every right to be angry because you're a victim of domestic abuse. You've been struggling for potentially quite a long time. And if you're angry about the situation, then that's a very valid emotion and valid response. So as I mentioned previously about reflective listening, art of summarising what the person has said, your body language as well is very important. So if you're sort of sat with your arms folded like this, it sometimes comes off like you're a bit guarded and you may be closed off to the information. So just sat nice and relaxed and just looking like you're just wanting to really take on board what that person is saying. So grounding exercises can be quite useful just to have on the spot. So if a person is extremely angry or a person is uncontrollably crying due to the situation, it's about pulling that person out of that situation and just trying to ground them for a moment. So there is a technique, I don't know if anyone's heard of the technique, it's just the 3-3-3 technique. So it's looking at examples in the room of things you can see, 3 examples of things you can touch, and 3 examples of things you can hear. So whether that's the birds cheeping outside, you may have a scarf, they may have a scarf around the neck that can touch, they may have a hot drink. So it's quite a simple exercise, but just making sure you're really taking time for them to come back and explain, what those 3 things are for each of those categories, and taking time to explore and discuss. And just those really simple tasks can help bring that person back into the room and help them come down a bit if they're angry or feeling really rather overwhelmed. And it's a practice that can pull you away from flashbacks as well. Unwanted memories can be quite intrusive, and it just helps you regulate yourself when you're facing really quite challenging emotions. So creating the right environment is extremely important. So ensure maximum privacy. So it's probably not a good idea to be seeing your clients in the middle of a crowded cafe. Think about where you might have some time on your own. If there is an inkling that there's a domestic abuse within the same household and they're still in that relationship, I would certainly never be advising anybody to go and visit that person at home. We've had lots of instances where there's been recording devices planted in homes. We've had CCTV operating, looking at people coming to and from the properties. Lots of ways where perpetrators can still be controlling and listening to everything that person is saying. And it puts you at risk and it puts the client at risk as well. So it might be that I've met people in local parks, I've met people at children's schools. You have to be quite creative sometimes. I would say that a good place to start if you're really struggling is maybe accessing the GP as well. We've had GPs who've been able to put false appointments in and all sorts, just so we're able to see those clients in a safe space. So always ensure the client is seen alone. Instances where the perpetrator may turn up to appointments, then it's always, to me, safer to abandon that appointment than put that client at further risk. If you have a person that doesn't speak English as a first language, we often have to use interpreters. Never, ever allow family members, even if they seem to have a good relationship, to start interpreting information, because you just don't know if those family members are exerting any sort of controlling, coercive behaviour, especially in the case of, for example, honour-based violence, where there might be multiple perpetrators and other family members are often involved in the situation as well. So always get someone independent just to make doubly sure that person is safe. So just some really quick do's and don'ts about responding to a domestic abuse disclosure. So always express concern for their safety and that of the children. Empower the victim with information that increases choices, that doesn't just tell them what they should and shouldn't be doing. Encourage the victim to take small steps, which will promote independence. Again, validate experiences, as we would have done in the conversation. Don't ask leading questions. So by that, I mean asking questions where you're almost putting answers in that client's mouth. Don't impose your own values. Well, I'd do this and I'd do that. And, Sue down the road has had this situation. And, it's about that person and what they're thinking and feeling at the time. So we're not overloading that person with services and decisions right there on the spot. We may come back to that when it's safe to do so, but at that moment, we're just listening and ensuring that person is safe. So don't expect quick decision making or contribute to unrealistic expectations. So we're just having a conversation, we're making sure the person is safe, and then everything else can be discussed at a later date. So what we need to do is establish the whereabouts of the perpetrator. So if that person has just disclosed that they're a victim of domestic abuse, is that person at work? Are they due back? Is that person safe in the property? And if that person is due back, how long might we have? Establish how much time the victim has to talk to you, which links again to where the perpetrator is. If that person's whereabouts and movements are being monitored, it may be that it's not safe to continue at that moment. And we may have to make a further appointment, whether it's on the phone or face-to-face, to speak about things. When I contact people, whether I've spoken to them before, my first thing I always say on the phone is, "Hi, it's Kate. If they know me, they know they've got my number saved, or if I've introduced myself, I will always then say, 'Are you safe to talk?' Because what you don't want to do is be keeping someone on the phone and actually that perpetrator is stood in the kitchen behind them, because again, it's putting them at risk. So always make sure you're establishing that first. Don't be surprised if they minimise experiences. It's often people's way of safeguarding themselves, especially if police has been an incident and police are involved. The thought of, for some people, of making a statement and going ahead with a prosecution is massive, because it can put that person at further risk. So it's not surprising that people will play down situations, because it's self-preservation and people will do everything they can to protect themselves, especially if there's children involved. But that doesn't mean with time they won't disclose a little bit more at a later date. So things to consider: is that person in immediate danger? So if you've made a phone call and they're saying somebody's at the door trying to get in, we don't want to then have a conversation. The obvious thing we'll do is we'll ring 999 and ensure the police have got that address and that they're called straight away. Has that client disclosed anything that might take priority? So intentions of suicide. So if you're suddenly discussing domestic abuse and that person is telling you they're suicidal, what we need to be doing is addressing the priority, which at that moment is going to be their mental health. So does that person need to get to A&E now, basically, because they're at risk from themselves? So we'll get the mental health sorted as the first priority, because obviously if they're displaying intentions of suicide, they're not in the right frame of mind to be discussing anything else. When that person is treated and potentially on the road to recovery, then we can look at everything else that follows. And also consider safeguarding referrals. So if there's been abuse disclosed, there's children in the property, always contact children's social care, just to run things by them, just to make sure that children are safeguarded. Or adults, if you are talking to the adult themselves and you are sort of disclosing abuse and you feel there may be some learning disability or anything that's may prohibit them basically from safeguarding themselves from abuse. So these are just things I'm just going to run through quickly. So if anyone was wanting to flee there and then, which can be a difficult situation, the best port of contact is always Oldham Housing Options, who are currently based in the Civic Centre. So I'll put the number there. It'd just be a case of giving them a ring and saying that person needs to flee. Or if you're really not sure what to do and a person is wanting to flee, you can contact the IDVA team, my team, directly, and I will give that number out at the end. So criteria to refer: they must be at risk of homelessness or fleeing domestic violence. They must have recourse to public funds. So sometimes if people have come over to the country on certain visas, they can't access benefits. But just to say, that's not a barrier at all for them accessing emergency accommodation. Ourselves and social care do have funds to put people up in B&Bs temporarily until we can look at the visa situation. So if in doubt, just give us a ring, basically. And that there is a number in case anybody's concerned about a child or an adult in terms of safeguarding. The number is up there and you just make a direct referral by giving that number a ring. So we're coming to the end now, but I will just say, I always mention Dash RIC, and for people that don't know, if there has been a disclosure of domestic abuse, so any professional or person working with a client is able to refer into our service using what's known as the DASH. So it stands for Domestic Abuse, Stalking and Harassment and Honour-Based Abuse Risk Indicator Checklist, which is a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? So that's why we abbreviate that to the DASH. The police do have their own DASH. So in essence, it's 24 questions which talks about the current abuse. It's a tick box, yes or no. So you're ticking yes or no to the answers and then putting your comment underneath. And it's essentially a referral into our service as well. So if you have had a disclosure and it's safe to fill out the DASH form, then by all means, we can send that form over to you, which is the direct referral into our service. If you're not sure and you've never done a DASH before, again, give us a ring. We can talk you through that. We can give advice. We can even take self-referrals over the phone. If you're just not sure and you want to support that client to make a self-referral, that's just a case of ringing our duty line as well, which is our main number, and we can access it for support as long as they meet the criteria for high risk. If they don't quite meet the criteria, there's no IDVA will be allocated, but we will still give that person advice and guidance over the telephone. It's not to say we won't give them that support, because we always would do. So, a bit repetitive from last week, but just for those who've not seen this, when a person is deemed to be high risk, which is at risk of immediate harm or death, then we will work with them as IDVAs. And those cases get discussed at our fortnightly MARIC conference, which stands for Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference, and it's chaired by the police. Lots and lots of agencies attend, ourselves, housing, social care, health, and we discuss those clients to look at the best way forward, look at what we know, and come up with a bit of a plan of action to safeguard them. So it's just to say that if you are filling out the referral form or people are about to self-refer, it's just some information to pass on to them that if you do score high enough, you'll be deemed to be high risk, which will give you an IDVA to work with, and also to let them know their case will be heard at the fortnightly MARIC, which is chaired by police. But it's absolutely nothing to worry about. It's just additional safeguarding and to make sure that people are getting all the support that they need, basically. So that's just who it's attended by there. I won't go through everyone. And And just to say, before you start filling out the dash, which we can send you, or before that person is due to ring to self-refer, again, just establish how much time that person has, if it's safe, because it can be quite a lengthy, I would say it can take about an hour, because it's a whole host of questions. It's 24 questions. Some people are quicker than others answering. Some people go into masses of depth. You're just not sure. And if you're not sure if that perpetrator is due to return to the home, just absolutely don't start that until they're at a point where they're safe and they're able to have that conversation. So just as we're coming to the end, some guidance and resources. So always advise clients to call the police in an emergency if they've disclosed domestic abuse. We can go through the self-referral, we can see if they need to access support, but it seems really obvious thing to say. But just ensuring that people know who to contact, because some people will tend to phone us first in an emergency. They might try and phone yourselves if there's been a disclosure. But if they're not safe and there's a massive risk to their life, then they need to be phoning police. Just advising people to keep the phone charged at all times, just in case they need to make that phone call. And then there's other resources there which you can look at your leisure. Just lots of advice and guidance generally around domestic abuse. Again, as I mentioned at the start, I always mention the one chance rule. The disclosure may be coming to you because this is the only opportunity that person may have to make that disclosure, especially if the perpetrator is still in the property, especially in cases of honour-based abuse where there's multiple perpetrators. Often that victim is not even allowed to leave the house on their own, go to appointments on their own. So if they've had that rare opportunity and the disclosure is coming to you, it's because it's a safe time for them to do so. So I always mention that please take every disclosure seriously. And if you need our support because you've had that disclosure, by all means, make sure you're giving us a ring. We're more than happy to support where we can. So finally, here are our contact details for the IDVA team. You can either email us to our central email address, or our duty line is open Monday to Friday, 9 till 4 p.m. Outside of that, if you're trying to contact housing, which is the number that came up previously, they do also have an out-of-hours housing telephone number as well, just in case people are deciding they want to flee at 4:30 on a Friday. Where on earth do I go? There's always out-of-hours number. So if you phone the main number and it's out of hours, they will give you the alternative out-of-hours number, just in case people need to flee there and then. But that's our number. And I will mention, I won't show this now, but we will circulate this presentation. So this is quite a new video that's been made. It's called Made by Mortals Production, and it's in collaboration with Oldham Council, and it's just looking at domestic abuse. This is specifically for older adults, but it just gives you a bit of an idea what it's like for victims to live within a domestic abuse relationship, still living with a perpetrator. So it's quite hard hitting. So it's just really worth a watch. But other than that, we've come to a close. So thank you very much, everybody, for your time. And if anybody has got any questions, I'm more than happy to sit and answer those. So thank you very much.